They laughed at her in court, but this defendant wasn't who they thought she was. She came prepared to rewrite the rules. The courtroom was packed, the kind of scene you'd expect in a high-profile case, not a routine hearing. People whispered their murmurs, blending into a low buzz that filled the room. At the center of it all stood a young black teenager, maybe 17. Tops her sneakers squeaked slightly as she shifted on the cold, polished floor. She didn't look nervous, though, not like someone accused of a serious crime. Her expression was calm, her hand steady, but the judge, he wasn't buying it. Judge Harold Brenner leaned back in his chair, his robe draped over his bulky frame like it had been hastily thrown on. He peered down at the girl through his glasses, the corner of his mouth curled in what could only be described as disdain. "Miss Freeman," he said, drawing out her last name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Do you even understand what you're being accused of?" Here the room fell silent, all eyes darting between the judge and the girl. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble with her words like he probably expected. Instead, she met his gaze calm and composed and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Greener scoffed, leaning forward now his tone dripping with condescension. "You sure about that? Because this isn't some after-school debate club. You're in a court of law." "Young lady," a few chuckles echoed from the gallery, and for the first time she let her gaze sweep the room. The crowd, most of them older, suited-up faces hard with judgment, looked at her like she was a spectacle, not a person. She let them look. There was something in her eyes, though, something that hinted she knew more than they did, but the judge wasn't done. "Don't know why they thought it was a good idea to let you speak on your own behalf. This isn't child's play," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "You're not equipped for this." Her lips parted slightly, almost as if she might respond, but then she closed them again, a faint knowing smile creeping onto her face. The gallery shifted, sensing something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The judge took her silence as a sign of weakness and smirked. "That's what I thought." What he didn't realize, what no one in that room realized, was that they weren't dealing with some scared teenager caught up in the system. She wasn't there by accident. She was there for a reason. And by the end of this hearing, they were all going to find out why. But what could a teenager possibly do in the face of a room full of doubters and a judge who'd already made up his mind? The judge tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythm sharp and deliberately. "Ton, get this over with," he muttered, flipping through the file. In front of him, the prosecution may proceed. The district attorney, a tall man with slicked back hair and a polished demeanor, rose from his chair. He shot a glance at the teenager, his smirk almost a mirror of the judge's. "Your Honor, this is an open and shut case. The evidence speaks for itself." He began pacing, presenting a well-rehearsed argument as though the teenager were invisible. The defendant, a minor, was found at the scene in possession of materials clearly linking her to objection. Her voice cut through the room like a sharp blade, calm, measured, and entirely unexpected. The DA froze mid-sentence, spinning on his heel to look at her. The gallery stirred, whispers swelling. Again, Judge Breener raised an eyebrow. "Objection," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Miss Freeman, do you even know what that means?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, unfazed. "The prosecutor is making assumptions about my intent without providing context that's speculative and inadmissible." A ripple of shock moved through the room. The DA stumbled over his next words, glaring at her like she'd just ruined his perfectly scripted moment. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "No, what's irregular?" she interrupted. "Is the lack of actual evidence tying me to any criminal activity." The judge's gavel hit the desk with a loud crack. "That's enough." Activity. The judge's gavel hit the desk with a loud crack. "That's enough," he snapped, his face growing redder by the second. "Miss Freeman, you are here to defend yourself, not to play lawyer. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." Her expression didn't waver. Understood, Your Honor. The day cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. He turned to the judge, attempting to brush off the moment. As I was saying permission to approach the bench, she said, cutting him off again. The gallery gasped audibly. This time, Judge Brenner stared at her, his face now a mix of irritation and disbelief. You don't get to make demands. In my courtroom, he barked. I'm not making a demand, Your Honor. I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense. She counted. Her tone was steady, unshaken. But if you're not willing to hear me out, I'll file a motion for recusal due to judicial bias. Silence. Deafening silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out what game she was playing. You think you're clever, don't you? He said. After a long pause, fine approach, she stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking. Again on the polished floor, every eye in the room followed her, the weight of their stares pressing down on her, but she walked like she didn't feel it. She placed a stack of papers on the bench in front of the judge, her hands steady as she slid them forward. This is a preliminary review of the evidence submitted by the prosecution, she said, her voice, even if you'll notice half of it is circumstantial and the rest lacks proper chain of custody. Judge Brenner glanced at the papers, his frown deepening as he skimmed through them. The day looked like he was ready to explode. Your Honor, this is absurd. She can, the judge muttered, cutting him off. He flipped through a few more pages before looking up at her. Where did you get this? I prepared it, she replied simply. And how exactly does a teenager like you know how to do this? She hesitated just for a moment and then said, I read. The judge's eyes narrowed further, but he said nothing. The gallery was silent again, everyone leaning forward in their seats as if they couldn't help themselves. But something about her confidence was starting to make people wonder, who was this girl really? The judge's face was a mixture of confusion and frustration. He shuffled the papers, again clearly searching for a flaw in her work, some kind of error that would justify dismissing her entirely. But it wasn't there. Every point she made, every argument was airtight. Miss Freeman, he said slowly, his tone laced with skepticism. This review of yours, where did you learn how to construct something like this? The teenager smiled faintly, her calm demeanor unwavering. Like I said, Your Honor, I read a lot. The DA was less composed. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We're wasting time. She's a child. This isn't a debate club. But the judge held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes stayed locked on the girl, scanning her face for answers. Who are you really? He asked, the question cutting through the tension. Like a knife, she paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom before returning to meet his. I'm someone who understands the law better than most people in this room, she said, her voice steady but now with a slight edge, and I'm here to prove it. A murmur rippled through the gallery again. People leaned in closer, whispering theories to each other. The tension was thick enough to cut, and the judge could feel it. Enough games, he snapped, though his voice had lost some of its earlier condescension. What's your point, Miss Freeman? My point, she said, stepping back slightly but still holding his gaze, is that I'm not just a teenager standing trial. I'm an attorney. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few outright exclamations of disbelief. The Durr slammed his hand down on the table. Your Honor, this is absurd. Sheck clearly lying. I'm not, she said, cutting him off, her tone sharper now. Clearly lying. I'm not, she said, cutting him off, her tone sharper now. I passed the California bar exam last year. You can look me up. Harper Freeman, licensed attorney. The judge stared at her, his jaw tightening as he tried to process what he was hearing. He turned to the clerk. Verify that, he said, his voice curt. The courtroom was silent again as the clerk began typing furiously, the sound of the keyboard the only noise in the room. It felt like an eternity, the air so thick with anticipation it was hard to breathe. Finally, the clerk looked up, her eyes wide. It's true, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Papa Freeman is a registered attorney with the State Bar of California. The gallery exploded once More louder this time, the judge slammed, his gavel demanding order. But even he looked shaken. His face was pale as he turned back to her. "You're telling me," he began, his voice unsteady, "that you're a licensed attorney at your age?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said firmly. "I graduated high school, early earned my degree and passed the bar exam, and now I'm here." The DA was sputtering, his face red with fury. "This is highly irregular. She shouldn't even be allowed to check," allowed the judge, interrupted, his tone now much quieter. He sat back in his chair, looking at her like she was an unsolvable puzzle. "I've never seen anything like this." Harper tilted her head slightly, her faint smile returning. "You underestimated me, Your Honor," she said. "A lot of people in this room did, but I'm not here to play games. I'm here to win." But as the weight of her revelation settled over the courtroom, one question lingered. How was she going to turn this bold move into a victory? The tension in the room was electric. Harper's revelation had shifted the power dynamic entirely. No longer was she just a teenager standing trial. She was a force to be reckoned with, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it. Judge Briner leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on his desk. "All right, Miss Freeman," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "You've got everyone's attention. Let's see if you can back it up." Harper took a deep breath, her calm composure unwavering. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. She turned to face the prosecution. "The first issue we need to address is the prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence. Let's take Exhibit B, for example, the surveillance footage." The DA, still fuming, folded his arms. "The footage clearly shows you at the scene of the crime," he snapped. "Yes," Harper said, nodding slightly. "It shows someone who looks like me near the scene, but what you failed to mention, intentionally or not, is that the timestamp on the footage is missing. The video was also retrieved from an unverified source, for which violates the chain of custody, Your Honor. Without proper authentication, this evidence should be inadmissible." The judge glanced at the DA, his brow furrowed. "Is this true?" The DA hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right words. "The footage is reliable, is it?" Harper pressed her voice, calm but sharp. "Because I have a forensic analyst report here that outlines all the inconsistencies in the file. May I submit it to the court?" The judge gestured for her to proceed. Harper handed the report to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. The judge skimmed it, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This raises serious questions," he muttered. The DA looked like he wanted to disappear. "Your Honor, this is just a tactic to derail the case. It's called due process." Harper interrupted. "Something you seem to have overlooked." The gallery murmured in approval, and Harper could see the subtle shifts in the room, people starting to believe her, starting to root for her. But she wasn't done. Next, she continued, walking back to her table and picking up another document. "Let's discuss Exhibit D, the so-called confession." This document was signed after hours of interrogation without legal representation present under federal law. That's a clear violation. Confession. This document was signed after hours of interrogation without legal representation present under federal law. That's a clear violation of my rights. You didn't request counsel. The DA shot back. "I didn't have to," Harper replied, her voice steady. "Minors are entitled to legal representation, period. That's the law. But let's put that aside for a moment. Even if we were to entertain this so-called confession, it's riddled with inaccuracies. For example, the address listed in the statement, it's wrong. I've never lived there. That's public record." The judge's face was unreadable as he turned to the DA. "Do you have an explanation for this?" The DA stammered, flipping through his pressed papers as though the answers might magically appear. You don't," Harper said, cutting him off. "Because you didn't do your homework. You assumed this case would be an easy win. You assumed I wouldn't fight back, but here we are, the judge held up, upper hand silencing both sides. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Harper. Miss Freeman, he said slowly, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? Here she straightened, meeting his gaze. With unwavering confidence, I'm trying to show this court that the justice system isn't about winning or losing, it's about truth. And the truth is, this case is built on shaky evidence and even shakier assumptions. The gallery was silent, every eye on Harper. Even the judge looked momentarily stunned, as though he wasn't sure how to respond. But the real question now was, could she convince him to rule in her favor? The courtroom was eerily quiet, kind of silence that made every creak of the wooden benches sound deafening. Judge Brenner sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Harper. The weight of her arguments, her precision and her confidence seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Finally he spoke. Well, he began, his tone more measured than before. Miss Freeman, you've certainly given us all a lot to think about. Harper stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. She didn't gloat or smile, she just waited, calm and composed, as though she already knew what was coming. The judge turned to the DA. Mr. Hensley, it's clear to me that there are significant issues with the evidence presented in this case. The chain of custody for Exhibit B is compromised. Exhibit D is inadmissible due to clear violations of the defendant's rights. I have no choice but to dismiss these pieces of evidence. Hensley's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Your Honor, with all due respect. With all due respect. Judge Brenner interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. You should have done your job better. This is my courtroom, and I won't allow it to become a circus. The DA sat down defeated, and the tension in the room began to shift. All eyes turned back to Harper. Some looked at her with disbelief, others with admiration. A few even nodded in quiet approval, as if silently acknowledging her brilliance. Judge Brenner cleared his throat and leaned forward. Miss Freeman, he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic, I must admit I misjudged you. I assumed you were just a kid out of her depth. I was wrong. Harper didn't respond. Right away she let his words settle, the weight of them filling the room. Then she said, thank you, Your Honor. But this isn't about me. It's about holding everyone, prosecutors, judges, and even attorneys like myself, to a higher standard. That's what justice should be. The judge nodded slowly. Well, said he. Replied. He took a deep breath before delivering his final decision. Based on the lack of credible evidence and the procedural errors brought to light, I have no choice but to dismiss this case. Miss Freeman, you are free to go. The gallery erupted. Some people clapped, others whispered furiously to one another, and a few stormed out clearly dissatisfied with the outcome. Harper stood there for a moment, letting it all wash over her. Then, with a small, respectful nod to the judge, she gathered her papers and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, people parted to let her through their eyes following her every step. Some looked at her with awe, others with a newfound respect. But Harper didn't linger. She pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped into the sunlight. Outside, a reporter rushed up to her, microphone in hand. Miss Freeman, can you tell us how managed to pull this off? What's your secret? Harper stopped and looked directly into the camera. There's no secret, she said. The law is meant to serve everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold. People like me, young black, underestimated. We're capable of more than you think. Today wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about proving that intelligence and determination don't come with an age limit. With that, she walked away, her head held high. The crowd outside watched her go, some still whispering in disbelief, others clearly inspired. Harper Freeman wasn't just a teenager or a lawyer. She was a reminder that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room is the one who changes everything in the end. Her story wasn't just about winning a case, it was about challenging perceptions and proving that greatness can come from anywhere. And isn't that something we all need to remember? What's stopping you from breaking the limits people place on you? Share your thoughts below. Let's start a conversation.